Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to associate myself very much with the Chairman's opening remarks about the contributions you've made, Mr. Ryan. I think they're genuinely significant and historic, and have done this country a great deal of good, and I'm personally grateful. Second, I want to remark on something that we don't often point out, but it says something good about both you and the President and our political system, the two people that were on opposite sides of the ballot, literally, at the top of the ticket in a political race in 2012, are here cooperating, setting aside their political differences because they think something important for the country is at stake. And you're both doing it at considerable political risk, and frankly, in this case, very difficult for the President of the United States. And I think we can say whatever we want about the agreement, but sometimes you need to take a step back and just thank people for the qualities and the leadership and the willingness to work together and put differences aside. And I think you're seeing that in a very spectacular way in this particular debate. Now, the trade is always a sensitive issue. And, I'm from a rural state, not a heavy manufacturing state, but we export over half the winter wheat that we grow in Oklahoma beyond the continental United States. And when I always hear about us losing jobs, I always remind people the largest single site employer in my district is Michelin Tire. We make more tires than anybody else in the world in my district, between Goodyear on one end of the district and them on the other. Are those 2,200 French jobs or those 2,200 American jobs? I have 1,000 people that work at an Hitachi plant. Yeah, probably hunts with you a little bit too. I thought so. I've got 1,000 Hitachi jobs. I've got French energy companies that are investing in Oklahoma companies and producing energy inside the United States. So your opening point about 95% of the consumers and really about 75% of the purchasing power being someplace outside the United States are really important. I've looked a lot at some of these trade agreements, and I think there's a great deal of misunderstanding. We always assume that somehow we're represented by people that are incompetent, incapable, and can never negotiate a good deal. And the other side is always represented by wizards and geniuses and people that always take us to the cleaners, and somehow America just can't sit down and negotiate a deal. I think one of the great myths, and I want to ask you to comment on this, frankly, in my view, is NAFTA. We hear this waved around all the time as if it was some spectacular American failure. And it was a Democratic president and a Republican Congress working together. How's that deal actually worked out in terms of the growth on both sides?
Yeah, it was Democrat president and the Democrat majority, with the majority of the votes supplied by Republicans. And then this is,
yeah,
the year I got out of college, so it's going back a ways. If you take oil out of the picture, we have a surplus with NAFTA. Number one. Number two, this TPP agreement that we're now trying to negotiate, and we will be able to close if we get TPA, raises the standards from NAFTA, because Canada and Mexico are a part of it. It actually brings the standards up from NAFTA, so it improves upon, makes more perfect. And look, NAFTA, believe me, there are issues with NAFTA. This helps fix a lot of those issues with NAFTA, but it has dramatically increased our trade between Canada, U.S., and Mexico. So there are a lot of good stories to tell there. Charlotte and Sam Goodwin's daughter works at the Michelin plant. And I know you know Sam Goodwin.
I do.
Great rancher outside of Madill, Oklahoma. And Twyla, their daughter, has been working there for many years, and she makes a really good living. And that's a very important factory. That's a big employer in Ardmore. But it's important that these kinds of manufacturers that we have markets to sell their products into. And tires is a perfectly good example. Very competitive, made all over the world. And if other countries get better market space, meaning no tariffs to sell their tires into other nations, and we have tariffs against it, we don't make more tires. That's the whole point of these trade agreements.
We actually, in another plant, a Goodyear plant, export tires to Japan from Lawton, Oklahoma. And actually, my good friend Ms. Slaughter and I, because I do think she raises an excellent point about the need to enforce the rules of the road and trade, actually testified together in a case where we saw the Chinese dumping in the American markets on steel radial tires, and they were slapped with a 35% tariff on the imports that were coming in by the WTO. So, yes, you've got to be vigilant, and yes, there are people that will try and game the system, no question about that. But at the end of the day, it seems to me you either have faith in free markets or you don't, and you have faith in American workers and American entrepreneurship, and you don't. And if you don't have faith in them, I don't see the future is going to look very bright.
I think that's a really good way of widening the lens on this. It's about, are you secure in the confidence of your country? And are you confident that your country can do well if given the opportunity? And I am.
Could I just briefly comment?
You certainly may.
Just briefly. I'm confident, provided the rules are written the right way. You mentioned tires. If we don't act, the Chinese inflow of tires is likely to undercut more and more production in this country.
I think that
It's a major dynamic, and we've been through this before because in the China PNTR bill, we had a provision relating to in case there was an influx from China, and it wasn't enforced under the Bush administration, though the ITC recommended it 4 times. It was a provision I put into the PNTR with Doug Bereiter. To the credit of this administration, when it came to tires, they did. Let me also say a word, though, if I might, about auto production. The estimate is that if not this year, next year, there will be more imports of vehicles from Mexico to the U.S. than from either Japan or Canada. Now, some of the parts come from the U.S. They do. But the wages in Mexico are 1/5 or less than they are in the United States. It's not the only reason. It's not the only reason that more and more plants have moved to Mexico, but it's one of them. And if workers in Mexico are not able to raise their wages, that dynamic is going to increase. It's one of the reasons.
Well, I think my friend makes a good point always about enforcement. And I think it's worth noting in this particular case, and as Mr. Ryan pointed out at the beginning of his remarks, we're talking about authority. We're not talking about agreement. And the Chinese aren't even part of the agreement that is coming down the road. This is actually positioning the United States a much better way, in my view, to compete against the Chinese in markets where we establish relationships and common rules of the road. Puts pressure on them.
To jump on that point, this is the kind of conversation we have with the neighbors, with China's neighbors, quite often, which is they're in a region where China is trying to assert its dominance in several different ways. They're building runways. This is unclassified. They're building runways on islands off the coast of Vietnam. They're doing certain things with Senkakus off the coast of Japan. But they're also trying to assert their economic dominance. And these countries we're negotiating with, these non-China countries we're trying to negotiate with, are to bring them to our system, to our standards, to our American free enterprise system, our rule of law, our enforceable contracts, our cross-border data flows. And that means we get more countries agreeing to play by these better rules instead of agreeing to play by these worse rules, the China rules that are, China's known for taking our data. They're known for hacking our computers, for stealing our intellectual property, for subsidizing their businesses to compete unfairly against ours, for dumping product into our marketplaces. So the question we ought to be asking ourselves is, do we want more of that? Do we want them to have that model replicated all around the region so we're confronting it from all over the world? Or do we want to engage and get other countries in the area to agree to buy our standards and isolate that practice so that as China rises, we know China's ascending. Are they going to ascend and rise responsibly and transition over to a rule of law system? Or are they going to try and hang on to the system they have now and get everybody else to play by their rules? That is what I see at stake with this kind of, with where we are in the world today and with what is at stake with TPA and therefore TPP.
Well, I very much agree with my friend's basic point, because trade's going to occur and somebody's going to be at the center of the system. And I have no doubt, look, I have enormous respect for my friends who have a different point of view on this issue. They're primarily on the other side of the aisle. I don't have any doubt about their sincerity. But I also wonder, if you don't trust this president from your own party, you know, who's got a demonstrated interest in environmental issues and labor standards and those sorts of things, then what president will you trust? Does that just mean we're just out of the trade negotiating business for all time? I think that would be an enormous mistake. My district, according to statistics we have 65,000 jobs that are trade related. That's in the middle of continental United States. That's not what it would be on the West Coast, which I think stands to benefit enormously from this, or with some of the high-tech industries that we have. But we are, you know, an exporting state. We export a lot of commodity prices. We export a lot of oil machinery and drilling and exploration equipment. You know, we export in this country a lot of airplanes. Boeing has a major presence in our district. You know, I just think the world belongs, the future belongs to people that are willing to compete. And, you know, setting up rules and making sure that that competition is fair and that there are appropriate standards, I think, is what you've got to be about. But the idea that you would pull back from it, I think, is just a mistake. You'll lose the future. And at the same time, I have enormous, look, I voted certainly to give President Bush this same kind of authority, and I'm willing to certainly do this for the President of the United States, because I don't see how in the world you can negotiate a deal with Congress. Now, having the veto, I appreciate very much the idea that everybody in America is going to get to see this final product, assuming we have TBA, but be able to see it. And frankly, I understand that in any agreement, there's winners and losers, not as countries, but individual sectors of the economy. That's the whole theory behind Ricardo's comparative advantage. So there's going to be some of that. And that's why, unlike some of my colleagues, I have no objection on my side of the aisle to TPP. I think it's an important thing to try and help people that, you know, may be through no fault of their own caught in a misfortune. But I don't see how in the end this isn't a net gain for the country, and I don't see how in the world you can achieve any agreement if you don't trust one person or the administration to negotiate the agreement, and then make sure that Congress has the ability, an unprecedented ability, to help set objectives, to help set standards, to have avenues for review and challenge that we simply haven't had before. And I thought these things before were still net balance, a very good thing for the United States. Good economically, first and foremost, but exceptionally good diplomatically and politically in terms of helping shape a world order that reflects our values and our vision and what we believe the world ought to become, instead of what somebody else. And again, somebody's going to play that game. So the idea that we can be excused from it, I think, is a big mistake. So I just want to thank you for the tremendous work that you've done. And again, I want to thank you, and I want to thank the President for the bipartisanship that you've both shown in this. It's not common that we've seen this, and the fact that both of you, whatever, again, disagreements we have, we'll have our debate over the deal, we're willing to put serious political differences aside and say, here's an area that we can cooperate for the good of the country, and it doesn't matter who won and lost the last election. We're going to find a way to get something done. We need to see a lot more of that around here, and I think in this case, particularly given the fact that you are a vice presidential nominee, you've demonstrated that in an exceptional way. And it's a fabulous civics lesson for the people of the United States about not losing faith in their political system and not losing confidence in the ability of people of goodwill, even when they have serious differences, to come together and recognize the national interest and work together to achieve that, even though I know it's difficult on your end, and I certainly know it's difficult for the president, who's finding himself at odds with his party in this case. He's to be commended for that quality of leadership. So with that, again, appreciate both of you. You're always challenging when you get here, and it's always decent debate and wonderful insight for this committee. So with that, Madam Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr.